So a couple days ago, my friend Phil called me up, or actually texted me about some questions he was having about music theory, and he was basically asking me like what kind of resources I've used to learn it before, and what worked for me, what didn't. And as we were talking about it, kind of realized how everything kind of has some deficiencies and some things that we would like to see changed, or like, and not only that, but like just talking about music theory with Phil and others like made me realize like how important it is just to discuss it. And so instead of like just pointing Phil to a certain book that I thought was great or something, I thought, well, why don't we just have a regular discussion about what we think uh, music theory is and where we're at and what we're trying to get out of it, and see if that helps us develop uh, our understanding better. And as even just saying that out loud is making me think like, yeah, what is music theory? Like, if someone's really good at music theory, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily a good musician, but it means that they're a good communicator about the things that they're hearing. So what better way to communicate than actually like talk to somebody about these things? And uh, you know, if it's useful for Phil and I, maybe it'll be useful for other people. So we're going to record it and see what comes about.
Uh, okay, so I'm Phil Petrucelli. I'm a musician and kind of creative. I've been in bands. I do photography. I do all kinds of like different types of things. Musically, I'm primarily a drummer. I'm playing a band called Great Falls here in Seattle. I'm located in Seattle. I've been playing with them. Next month, it'll be 10 years. Really stoked about that. Super proud of our work. For me, it's probably been one of the best creative relationships I've had, if not the top best creative relationship I've had with a band. And on the side, I actually have services available for like mixing. Mastering is a big one for me. I feel like I've done a lot of that, and I think that mastering types of things in terms of like the technical side may dovetail with what we're talking about music theory wise, because I feel like some of that is a technical pursuit. um, but yeah, so that's like basically the short intro to who I am and what I do here in Seattle.
Cool. Before I introduce myself, can I just ask you a question about you?
Yeah, of course.
Do you consider yourself a professional musician?
I mean, there's the rule of thumb that if you get paid to do it, then you're a professional. But there's no rule that says if you get paid sometimes or get paid irregularly or paid for a few years and then stop and then paid again. I suppose so. I mean, I would say I'm better than or not better, but closer to professional than like a prosumer type of person. Like, you know, they use that for for as a marker of kind of where you are on the pay and work spectrum. So I would say I'm somewhere. I'm probably a little bit closer to professional. Yeah. I don't do that
Uh,
as my main. I don't do that as my main gig, but it's enough.
yeah. Well, I think, between the two of us, you're definitely the more professional musician. I asked that question because, like, this idea of getting paid, like, I do a lot of things with music and I get paid for them, but I still don't consider myself a professional musician.
Uh-huh.
My profession revolves around music,
Right.
but it's not necessarily about me making music myself, like composing. I'm not a professional composer. I'm a programmer of computer programs, and most of what I do revolves around this. So I guess I should introduce myself. My name's
Yeah.
Aurelius Prochazka, and I am the co-founder or the founder of AudioKit. And AudioKit is a programming framework for doing audio on Mac, iOS, iPad, tvOS devices, and a lot of people use it to make musical instruments and variety of other audio related thing. But most people do music, and so I get paid to write music apps basically, and I give away the audio kit for free. But then a lot of clients will come in and they'll say, "Oh, we want this special thing," and since we're using audio kit and you did it, maybe you'd be the best person to program the next refinement to their app or what have you. AudioKit also makes a bunch of their own app and I work with my collaborators to develop those. Uh, but it puts me in an interesting position because I work with a lot of really great musicians to make these apps,
Mhm.
and they're good at communicating what they want musically. But even sometimes, then they're not even that good at communicating with words and with concepts. So I feel like my working knowledge of music theory is coming from that direction. It's not from a professional musician, but as a professional like musicologist or whatever the word is.
Sure.
And I think it's an interesting combination of Phil and I, and that's why I'm really looking forward to these discussions. Actually,
Mhm. Cool. So for me, like music theory wise, so as I said, I'm a drummer primarily. I do read music. Like I get all of that. I've composed songs, I've more written songs or whatever. I can throw notes together that sound good. I would say my role in Great Falls is actually an equal stake in terms of songwriting. And we're a metal band with like some sort of like I would say some sort of like angular sounds, time signatures, and things like that. Um, for me, I've been a fan of guitar for a very long time. I think that's one spot where Ari and I share some like passion. I play a little bit of guitar. I play very little, and not much that I would play in front of people. I don't think, but I've recorded some and done that. Um, Earlier in my career or whatever, as a kid, I played in like the citywide orchestra in New York City, and I was in the percussion section, so I did read music. I passed an audition, blah blah. But then I think as I progressed through just being in bands, and most of them were, most of them have been metal bands, some sort of jazz things as well. I know how to play that kind of stuff. I really haven't like read music, and I write. Write has quotes around it because I actually don't write down my part and like send it to ASCAP or something and get it published or anything like that. I know a lot of professional musicians do that. I'm not in the musicians union, like none of that sort of stuff. But I think where I'm going is that mostly this stuff is, I think it's kind of like a result of training my ear somewhat, like kind of noticing what I enjoy about songs and songwriting and aesthetics and things like that. I've always thought that aesthetics before technical skill, I thought was an interesting rule of thumb for me, and I think that continues. But then I kind of got interested in I've done some like remixes for my band, and then we've talked about also doing things like some like string accompaniments for some of the stuff that we do, just to kind of embellish or to kind of give like a deeper or a more dimensional sound to some of the things that we do. We have quiet passages, that's allowed in metal, so we do that. Um, and like that's always been interesting to me. I feel like I've always enjoyed things like just music, soundtrack music, scores from when I was a little kid. Like I really enjoyed when I was younger. I really enjoyed like the Rocky soundtrack. I would listen to that over and over for whatever reason. I guess probably just a popular movie at the time. Of course, I'm a Star Wars kid, so I know the John Williams things and that kind of stuff. And then I just got interested in doing, thinking about and actually executing on some sort of like string arrangements and things like that. I feel like that's been an interest of mine for a long time, but never like pulled the trigger. And as I started to do it, I was doing it all by ear, along with songs that I knew very well from Great Falls that we wrote together. And some interesting things started to happen. I mean, I felt like that it was going quite well, and that I thought that it was like the accompaniments were, or writing these accompaniments or whatever, were somewhat natural for me. And then I just kind of tried to get a similar thing going in like my own style or my own like solo-ish ways, and I started to mess around with that. And I have, and I think everybody who messes around with music has a folder on their drive with unfinished ideas or seeds or motifs or whatever you want to call them. And I certainly am no exception. I have tons of this stuff littering my hard drives. But now suddenly it's like like string section sorts of things, and I have a handful of these things. And I'm also a technical person. I mean, Ari and I met in engineering school. Um, and this is where like the mastering thing fits in. Like I would like mastering, I would consider to be like a very like technical, super technical side of getting music ready for release and things like that. You know, knowing the constraints of the medium and blah blah blah. Lots of low level stuff that no one cares about, or mastering engineers only care about, and you care about it. As long as your record doesn't sound like Death Magnetic when you listen to it, that kind of thing, right?
Or Justice.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe that might be more mixing than mastering, but definitely the loudness wars is the mastering thing. But yeah, like that's always appealed to me. I've also done photography, and photography for me had been like a mastery of how to print things accurately. You know, I have an aesthetic and a compositional well, focus, or you know, I think that I found a voice in that, but I think the voice is actually way more like solidified with those low level details. And I feel like it's kind of natural with music theory that that's like actually working with strings and instruments other than what you find in a typical metal band or whatever, like has kind of provoked that sort of interest in me in like the lower level technical sorts of things like, hey, why does this sound good, number one, if I do it by ear, and number two, okay, something sounds good, and now what are my options about where I should go? And those are like the two like overarching questions, I would say. I mean, and I
Yeah.
listen to all kinds of stuff. I just recently watched the master class by Danny Elfman about how to do musical scores or music for film. I'm almost done watching the Hans Zimmer one, which is also quite interesting. And those guys are like technical, but then also not. They have like a really nice balance of those things, and that's my I pretty much like desire in my life. And then as a player too, I'm kind of technical, but I wouldn't say I was overly technical like that sort of thing. But filling in the theory piece, like I mean, being able to look at like 4 or 5 measures of music written out and being able to hear it in my head, I absolutely cannot do that. I actually don't even play piano or keyboard very well. It's like hunt and peck to get the right notes. And that's pretty much like that's kind of like the start for me about like what's the deal with this music theory stuff, and like how do I get deeper into it, or how do I just find out these lower level things that sort of interest me and I feel like would complete the picture for me somewhat.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. The only thing that you were saying there that I kind of like make my ears like tingle a little bit in terms of thinking like I wonder if we'll really get that from this. Is you seem to think of music theory to explain the why of why does this sound good, like, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that might be asking a bit too much of music theory.
Sure.
What's when something sounds good to you, it just sounds good to you.
Right.
What's cool about music theory to me um, is you start to develop a set of rules or words around remembering and categorizing, chronicling those things that you think sound cool,
Yeah.
so that you don't have to just try to like remember them for their feeling, but you can kind of put them in a library of information that you just know.
Uh-huh.
And it's to me like that's why I was saying music and music theory are two different things. If someone is a good uh, has a wide vocabulary and they know all the words, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a good storyteller.
Sure.
So with music, if you feel something and it feels good, then that's great. Just know that that's the case, and explain it, or at least describe it with music theory. The explanation might be too hard. It's like it just hits you in the bones the right way, and it kind of reminds me of one of the things that where music theory has worked for me recently, is I I like certain songs from a variety of different artists, and I was always wondering, like, why do I like the songs that I like? And so
Yeah.
I like Duran Duran songs, I like Blondie songs, I like Kiss songs,
Yep.
and Metallica. And I went through and I started to analyze some of those songs that I really like, and I was realizing that they have some certain techniques in common. Even though there's wildly different sounds, they have certain melodic techniques that I really like. Uh,
Hmm.
borrowing accidental notes from other keys, or
Yeah.
descending to the dominant seventh instead of the major seventh. And these are not, they didn't resonate with me because they did these things, but it's a good way to describe some of the so, what worked could be described as music theory. It can't be explained by music theory, but it can be described by music theory.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I totally hear that. And even just the description that you used of like, yeah, does this thing go from the dominant seventh to the minor seventh, or this, like that's a part of the language that I actually don't have, and that's like I want to use that language or actually understand it and see, yeah, in a similar way. Like, yeah, there's no way that I'm thinking that Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley are, really into music theory, but they're just like, yeah, let's write songs about partying and girls, and that's what they did, and that's definitely their thing. But in hindsight, certainly we can think about those things, right? There's tons of guys on YouTube talking about the Beatles, right? Always. And there's one guy whose name I can't remember, but he's got a thing where he goes back and forth about whether the Beatles actually knew theory or not. And it's one of those things where they're like showing super old interview footage of the Beatles and then more recent stuff. I mean, mostly Paul McCartney and well, it has to be Paul McCartney and Ringo at this point. But yeah, they're talking about whether they knew stuff or not, and it seems to be a mixed bag. I watched an interesting one where they were talking about something like they knew a guy elsewhere in Liverpool who knew about a new chord, and they'd get on the bus and go learn the chord from the guy and then come home, like that kind of thing. It's like, wow, all right. Is that theory? I don't know, but they certainly knew that it sounded different or that they could use it to kind of season what they were doing and maybe make it more interesting or whatever. But I mean, their story is complicated, right? Because George Martin had as much to do with some of their ideas and things that made it to tape finally as anybody else. And George Martin is a guy with good ears and then good technical know-how as well, blah, blah, blah. And then there's, the Beatles just kind of woodshedding it like on tours through, didn't they do residencies or something like that in Germany for like months on end, like honing their craft. And then they became the Fab Four, that kind of thing. So who knows?
and
But
then they continued it with like Indian influence and stuff too. It's
yeah,
definitely something that
totally.
was throughout their career. They were like that.
Yep.
Um, and you also mentioned before you were mentioning the sketches of music that you have on your hard drive,
Yeah.
and I'm so guilty of that. I've sent you a few of those recently,
Yeah.
and I have a guitar teacher who I've been working through some of that stuff with, and just in trying to explain to him what what my sketches are, like through email before I even send him the the actual audio file.
Right.
That's another way I found like music theory to be interesting, to tell him, hey, I did this thing where I accidentally went into this key and it sounded cool. And
Yeah.
he's always telling me, just feel it. That's what music teachers always just say, do it what you feel. But it's been useful to develop my own style and to describe my own style to other people. Um, so I think that's where I'm coming from. You mentioned a lot about what you were coming from. I'm coming from a place where I'm trying to get. I'll never be Steve Vai guitar, and I'm not going to be really great. But recently, people have listened to my stuff, and they've said, "Hey, that sounds like Ari,"
Yeah.
and that is like a huge. That's all I could possibly ask for at this point. I'm never going to be this great technician. I'm not going to be famous on stage and anything. But if I can develop my own style and push that as far as I can take it, I'm going to be personally rewarded for doing that.
Sure.
And so, if music theory can play a part in that and developing it, then that's totally the reason why I've learned it to the point where I have, and why I want to continue onwards. It's all about like communicating with other people. Even the other day, I play in this cover band, and I was playing something wrong because I was playing it by like how I found out Ultimate Guitar, and they were like, "No,
Right.
it doesn't sound right." I'm like, "Well, I know for a fact this is what I learned,"
Yeah.
but they actually, we figured out what the chords were, and they could say, "Oh, it's a minor seventh and then to a major seventh," and luckily I was good enough with that communication that I could
Yeah.
fix it and
Yeah.
not look like a completely tone deaf asshole. Yeah, at the rehearsal, like, yeah, this guy just learned from the book and couldn't
Yeah.
adapt his with new information. So
Yeah.
I think that's why you're learning it. If you were just like doing this work on your own, you may not need music theory enough. But if you're trying to either
Yeah.
communicate to other people or develop your own uh, style that it's beyond, like, so you can take steps forward, is I guess what I'm saying. So you can say, okay,
Yeah.
I
Totally.
understand this, now I can move on.
Yeah, there are 2 or 3 fragments on my hard drive right now where I'm just like, well, there's one where some chord that I chose does not fit. Like everything else is great, or it sounds good to me anyway. But there's one chord where I know what I want to do, but I don't know how to form it. And that's largely about context and then understanding for me, again, like what are my options at this point? Either, so in this case, I have a context with a chord that's not quite right in the middle somewhere, not right to my ear. And it's like, okay, so what are my options? What does the context tell me that my options are? Because the rest of things sound great with like literally the exception of just this one chord. I know that I want something to like dip down mood wise for a second and then come back up, but I actually don't know what my options are. And how do you do that? And then there are others that are like, they're pretty good. And then at some point I just hit a dead end or a roadblock going, okay, so now to like change this to like a B section, or maybe I have an A and a B and I want a C or something. What do I do? And you mentioned just in passing, like, oh, borrowed accidentals and borrowed chords and modulation and blah, blah, blah. Like all of that, yes, agreed, is like the language. And I know what those mean, like sort of technically. But when I like put my hands on the keyboard or I use one of those Native Instruments Machina controllers. And what's nice about that, it actually has this chord mode, so you can actually load up a melodic sound, a piano or whatever, or even like a marimba or a drum kit that's tuned or something. And with one button, like it plays chords either built on thirds or fourths or whatever. Like, and I didn't even realize like that chords are really like chords that we do all the time, major triads or whatever, minor triads on guitar and in just like rock and roll or just like built with thirds. I actually didn't even know that much. Like it's just a combination of thirds, and uh, and it's that combination that makes them sound how they do. Blah blah blah. I mean, a lot of times when we're writing in Great Falls, Damien, our guitar player, he doesn't use a conventional tuning. He uses his like own crazy tuning where the lowest string is a B, and he has a like super interesting style and way of coming up with riffs and things like that. To me, like totally unique. But occasionally he plays a chord, and I was like, ah, that sounds so good. Like, let's write stuff around that that supports it. But I couldn't say up a third, down a fourth to him, and he doesn't care. And I kind of don't care either. That's the feeling thing that you're saying. But there is something about that chord that's just like, damn, it has a little bit of dissonance, but it's like very heavy down below or whatever, right? How I describe these things. I don't in that context, I don't think I would ever do that. We always make fun of people who do that thing where they hold their ear and they go up a minor third, like they sing. That we always make fun of that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
That probably will continue as such there, but yeah. So it's that sort of like, what do I have access to here? Like, what are my options when I'm either at a dead end or there's something in context that doesn't sound quite right? And yeah, so part of it is the language. I agree with you. And then the other part I also feel like is just like, again, this like sort of like technical knowledge, but like, modulating and going to what key and how you do it cadence wise and all that. Like, I know all the words, but I mean, I have a book that's like half filled, like half of the book is about common cadences or kind of what your options are. I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I'm still confused about quite a few concepts, and I think there are probably quite a few basic concepts, but the connections are starting to form, which is kind of interesting.
So your primary interest is the drums, and
Yep.
you you're a great drummer, and you feel very comfortable behind the drum set.
Uh-huh.
And is there music theory? I don't know much about this. Is there like music theory around the drums, like or let's say vocabulary or terminology around the drums that when you hear those words, you immediately are parsing them and translating them to something musical. Whereas when you hear the word someone saying the Mixolydian scale, you're
Yeah,
like, what? I don't know what that is.
yeah.
Is that, do you feel a difference there?
Um, yes, and I have some of that. Like, so of course, people talk about the 26 rudiments of the on the drums, and those really are just permutations and combinations of sticking patterns, and that largely comes from a marching tradition. We see that in that kind of stuff. Whatever whatever your local football team does on the sidelines or during halftime, that kind of stuff. But even then, all of those things have different languages, but they actually mean the same thing. Like classically, there's like 26 rudiments, and it's not a coincidence. There are also 26 letters in the alphabet, kind of thing. But then when I listen to or watch a guy who's teaching about how to play drums in a drum line, he has a totally different set of words that they use, but a lot of the concepts overlap a lot. And then the other thing is when you learn the rudiments, because it's only sticking patterns, you usually concentrate on one drum, usually the snare drum or something. And then where they begin to open up is when you sit behind your drum kit and have one hand on the ride cymbal and one hand on the snare drum, and you play the same rudiments. Then it like breaks things up between multiple sound sources. That's where it becomes sort of interesting. Um, and I would say that's probably the only vocabulary I have about that stuff. And prior to playing with Great Falls, like I really didn't play very much in odd time signatures. And there's probably a bunch of reasons. Like I'm a 4/4. Like I learned how to play drums by listening to Led Zeppelin records and playing along with them. That's mostly 4/4. There's a lot of stuff that's like 6/8. Of course, they did a lot of shuffles and things like that, and an occasional odd time signature. But I really didn't do very much. And then I joined Great Falls, and their time signatures are all over the place. And Shane and Damien, bass and guitar respectively, they think about time and about just like about time and riffs and like how to resolve things over time in a way that I've never heard before. I mean, there's mostly no formal thinking about it. It's entirely by gut feel, and like we've got like a ton of records at this point and a ton of songs that we've written and done together. And yeah, we count things out and we write a song map and all that kind of stuff like normal band does. But I had to really, and I'm still wrapping my head around like how to play in odd meters. Like it's changed my style of playing for sure. And it's really interesting to think about how 10 years ago, like pretty much to the day, I was I felt like I wasn't able to do that, but now we've just got bunches of songs that do that sort of thing. But the other thing is that I've been playing drums so long that when I sit down behind a drum kit and I set it up the way I want, like I feel like I could, like you said, sound like Ari. Like I could sit down and sound like Phil, no matter
Mm.
what, and then go from there. So I feel like that's where I'm at with drums, but not much else. That's yeah.
There's a couple term. Also, tell you some terminology in the drum world that I feel like I don't understand. Is like I was watching someone uh, review Fiverr drummers that they hired to play over a part,
Oh yeah, I think I saw that one yesterday. I watched it yesterday.
and he kept on he kept on saying, "Oh, they missed the chance to push
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
the beat,"
yeah,
and I had no real idea of what that meant. And suddenly, I felt like the dog listening to classical music. Like, what does he mean by pushing the bit? He was using it all the time, like it was
yeah.
common terminology.
We watch the exact same video. I watch that guy now and then. Um, but he was using it in an interesting like sort of way, like that the act like the next section like didn't land on the one, but it was actually almost like a pickup into the next section that you were actually supposed to accent the pickup as well as and your choice was to act well. What he wanted to hear was you accenting the pickup, and your choice would be to accent the pickup as well as the one, or let the one just kind of slide by and let the two define where the next section kind of was.
I
And then,
see.
two of those, like those two variations are kind of interesting. But what his, like, I would say the thread of the video is how different players pick up on the accents or not. Like, I felt like overall, he was not stoked that people didn't pick his like rhythmically interesting like little bit. Yeah, we watched exactly the same video.
It ended with the
Watched it last
lady, the
night.
tattoos who completely
Yeah,
crushed.
totally.
Yeah,
Yeah, totally. And that was really good. Her feel was excellent. Yeah, I mean, I watch those kinds of things all the time. If I'm not like watching MIT Open courseware for my day job, like as a math person, like yeah, the rest of the time I'm watching these guys with real technical discussions of music. And the guy that I really really like is Adam Neely. Like I love that guy's technique. He's like he has a really great balance of technical and I think feel, and he also has a really great way of describing these like kinds of things and discussing them.
sure.
He's a little heavy on New York jazz is the only music in the entire world, but that's what he does. He
Yeah,
he is fantastic. Like that's the kind of guy that I really dig. Again, because he has like some balance between the low level technical stuff and then playing. Like the one where he had a video where he talked about is this whole A440 tuning, or A is the other one like 432 or some weird thing where you choose where the
yeah, yeah.
constant A pitch is. And like, it's the music they don't want you to hear. That's why they make you tune to 440. It's like, oh man, I can't wait. Then dude tunes his entire keyboard using this microtonal software or something, and then demonstrates like jazz standards on it. Like that is some like inside baseball, which and he does it like to me, I think he does it perfectly, and then mixes it with like, well, this is what an actual song sounds like, and this is why. Like really, really interesting. So a guy like
Yeah.
that, that's my go ahead.
I just let's say the only thing I can say that I always, and this may come up as a thread between you and I, is that
Yeah.
I always watch these YouTubers with a little bit of doubt, a little bit of suspect, because um, two things. One is that to be successful on YouTube is you have to be entertaining the way that you describe things and the way you present
Yeah,
things.
totally.
And so I feel like sometimes the person with the right information is not the person who's presenting it. So Adam Neely is a very good presenter,
Uh-huh.
and he plays music fairly well. But I haven't heard him compose anything, and maybe the
Mhm.
really good composers are not wasting their time on YouTube.
That's
Uh,
also possible, yeah.
but I just feel like it's just like if you. Is Adam Neely a professional musician for his work on YouTube that he's getting paid for? I don't think so. I think he's a
Oh, yeah, I mean,
professional
yeah.
educator and a professional describer, but I don't know that that's actually being musical. But
Yeah, it's like the band teacher at your high school. Is he a professional musician because he's getting paid to teach you band?
yeah,
Stuff like that.
exactly.
But I mean, Adam has a body of work, and
Oh, I know. He
full
probably is
transparency,
professional based on it.
yeah, I actually have never really listened to his bands at all. Like I just, and
Yeah.
that's a little bit of a time constraint. I'd love to listen to the entire Adam Neely catalog, but I just have a time constraint where I just can't at the moment.
Sure. And by the way, I love Adam Neely too, but I just, like I said, I always listen with a little bit of skepticism. But back to the reason I was asking you about like rudiments, or
Oh
actually I was
yeah.
asking about general music theory, is that so you mentioned rudiments and how you're like you learn these as sort of I took it to mean like as a practice tool, as a way to get
Uh-huh.
physically good at something, and then
Yep.
you don't throw it away, but you use it in different contexts. You'll hit
Yep.
different drums with it, and things will flow out of you easier because of the hard work of putting in the rudiment practice. And that to me sounds like if we're moving towards like the more melodic music theory
Uh-huh.
aspect of music theory, it sounds to me like a scale is to like a guitarist. They'll play scales up and down all the time, not because scales necessarily sound all that good. It's just a good way of saying, okay, I know I'm going to be able to play those five notes super fast, or I'm going to be very comfortable on the
Uh-huh.
fretboard, and then I'm going to use it in a different context. I'm going to mix it up with. I'm not just going to play that for.
Yeah,
You might be
totally.
practicing a certain rudiment for 20 minutes, but you're not going to play a song in that rudiment for 20. You might be throwing it
Yeah.
in as a really quick thing, and so that's where we want to get to with the melodic side of things, where you're like, okay, I have a basic feel for what this is, but I know how to pepper it in, but it's not like I'm just going to spend an hour working on the Mixolydian scale and then I'm going to have it for good. No, it's you want to be able to use it where it's needed.
Yeah, it's
And
like putting salt in your food kind of thing. It's like same kind of thing. Like too much is too much, but just right. You know it when it's just right. Yeah, totally.
yeah, I think by having a lifetime spending doing well at drums, you're looking for another way to like uh, to expand that into other parts of music with the same sort of structure. And
Yeah,
I'm hoping that music theory can do that for you. In some ways, the uh, thing that annoys me about music theory is the words are so weird.
yeah. I
Like
mean, that, yeah,
all the names of the modes are
yeah,
weird. Even
yeah,
saying that chords are separated by thirds and fourths, like these are a
yeah.
weird combination of like uh, Greek and Latin words, and then sort of mathiness. Because we all know. So let me just say this to start off with:
Yeah,
Phil and I are both very mathematical. If we find a way to describe something mathematically, we will totally latch onto it.
yeah,
The problem I have with music theory is it was mathematics applied towards music by non-mathematicians. So
yeah,
they were kind of like, we're going to call this the sixth because it's the sixth up, but it's not really indicative of sixthiness.
yeah,
It's it's just happens if you count from 1 to 6, it's a sixth note. But
yeah.
other than that, it's like it's not divisible by the thirds, or there's no the under. It's just a word at this point. It's not. It's kind of different from
Totally,
mathematics.
totally.
Um, it reminds me of this my guitar teacher long ago. He knew went to Caltech and was a very technical person, and I was working my rhythm with him, and he's like, "Why is rhythm so hard for you? All it is dividing things in half, dividing them by three.
Right.
You should be totally great at this. Like, why is this difficult for you?" And I'm like, I can also tell you, you know, how to throw the basketball in a perfect arc
Yeah,
so it
right.
lands in the middle of the thing, but
Yeah.
you put a defender on me and you have to use my own muscles to do it. It's a totally different thing. So the
Yeah,
mathematics, of course, is a perfect way of describing things,
yeah.
but it's not it's different than music. And when I hear the words combining and the some people write entire textbooks where they use mathematical symbols and they're describing music, and just the fact that music has like frequencies of 440 and
Sure.
432 is like
Yeah.
you think there's this connection between math and music, but I think the connection is there only in that mathematics can describe anything and music is a thing. So you can describe music
Sure.
with mathematics.
Yeah, sure. Totally.
But I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, to to go along with that, like as I'm reading about yeah, the intervals and this and that and the other thing. So I knew from, I don't know, probably hearing maybe Frank Zappa mention it, two things. One is like all you need is a tonic and a fifth, and away you go. Like he said that. And then the other thing was that there's a bunch of like live stuff of his that I have. I have like a pretty extensive Zappa collection, where they would always be riffing on Louie Louie, and Louie Louie is 145, right? In various, well, in actually one pattern the entire time, and maybe a key change, but after the key change is still 145. So I'm reading these music theory things, and it's root, in a major scale, the second degree is minor, the third is also minor, then perfect fourth, perfect fifth, blah blah blah, all the way up to the octave. And I'm reading in these music theory books that the the fourth, called a perfect fourth, actually is very difficult to deal with in context. Like, I can't think of a worse name than perfect for to describe a perfect fourth. Like they're saying, oh, it's depends on the context what happens, and then it has no pull toward the tonic, it has no pull toward anything else. A fifth has a pull, and a seventh has a pull. But they're saying, like, so I'm like, why the heck would you call it a perfect fourth? And there's like there's a not a nitpicky technical reason, but just like a total low level reason why it's called that, and it has to do with how it inverts to a fifth and all this kind of stuff. But that honestly is kind of shocking in my naive new music theory world is that the fourth is actually not stable at all, yet it's called the perfect fourth, like that kind of thing. It's like
Mhm.
super interesting to me. And then knowing that 1 4 5 is like a classic blues progression, and of course, since rock and roll is derived from the blues, and then other things are derived from that, like that's it's part. You're like listening to 1 4 5 all the time, and now suddenly it's like a challenge for you to write this out. The other thing is, yeah, the mathematicians thing. Like, there are people, and I'm sure we all either know them or have heard of them, who will just like start with a blank piece of paper and choose a key and choose a mode and then just write stuff because it like is formulaically correct without ever hearing it, whether it sounds good or not. That sort of thing. That's definitely not where I'm at, because I think, or maybe they hear an aesthetic in their mind while they're writing it down. I find it hard to believe, to be honest. But yeah, that's not where I'm at either. That's extreme in the technical direction. And I think any good artist has some sort of medium between the technical and the aesthetic, or the technical and the feel sort of part of it. But yeah, like these interesting things sort of jumping out at me, are kind of interesting. Like, what makes extended chords like sound good, or why do we think that they're kind of interesting? Like, another band that I really enjoy is Voivod, right? They're from the band from Montreal, I think, and mostly in the '80s had really good records, and would probably be called progressive metal, for better or for worse. And yeah, like the guitar player's thing was like seventh chords and ninth chords, or ninth chords and 11ths maybe, and that's kind of interesting to me. And then again, speaking of Adam Neely, like he talked about like a ninth inverts to a minor second or something like that, right? A
Mhm.
major ninth inverts to a minor second. And if you play a minor second right next to the root, it sounds like shit. But if you move it up and call it a ninth far away, it sounds awesome. And that's like, and why is that? Like that kind of thing. It's like, yeah, that guy's signature sound was those types of chords, which you don't expect to hear in metal. But it sounds awesome. And like, why is that? Well, part of it is because it's far enough away,
Mhm.
either above or below, blah, blah, blah. Like those types of discussions are pretty darn interesting to me. And again, there's just a certain like vocabulary, like you said, and then a certain grammar on top of that makes these things make sense to me in a way. And I feel like that's what I'm after at the moment. And I actually have no idea whether whatever the end result is. I mean, I just gave myself like the summer to just like really dig into this stuff and see where it leads me.
Yeah.
Will I have an answer about that? I really don't know.
I don't know if Adam Neely must have discussed in the video. I actually haven't seen the one that you're mentioning about. Um, but the ninth thing, I was also really perplexed by that, how it's so related to the minor second. It's
Yeah,
basically just, it's not so much that it inverts, but that the ninth is an octave away
yeah,
from the second. So it'll sound like a note that sounds bad with the chord. And how is that possible?
yeah,
And the description of how that happens is not the why, it's the description of how that happens. But basically, because if you go on the scale and you say a chord is created by adding in thirds, so the the root chord is called the root note of the chord is called the one, and then you go up to the third, so that's skipping over the two, you get to the third, which here is another one of those words, minor or major. Like,
yeah,
I have never understood that either. Like, why is this more majory and why and minor? So,
yeah,
and then people say, well, think of it sad and happy. But that's a rule that doesn't work all the time either. So anyway, so you go from your first to your third, and then you go to skip the four, go to the five,
yeah,
and you've got your full chord.
yeah,
And then you go up again, skip the sixth, get to the seventh, and that still sounds good. It sounds a little more jazzy now. But you can keep that going. So you skip over the eight, which is the octave. Why would you
yeah,
skip over that? We don't know, and go to the ninth,
totally.
and then it still sounds good. But I think one of the reasons why it sounds good is that if you just subtract off the first notes you've had, you're still going by thirds. So you have that ninth
Yeah,
supported by things that are harmonious with it, like the seventh and the fifth underneath it, that are
right.
closer, that they themselves fall like form good harmony together. So it's not so much you're constantly comparing to the root, but you're comparing to all the notes that are around. I think if you play like the minor ninth and the root, you're still going to hear some badness. But if you throw in
Like alone, like alone, just those two notes.
exactly,
Yeah,
yeah,
totally. Yeah, and
um,
I'd really never considered that, and I think it was from that same video that I started reading. Oh yeah, it's just called 20th Century Harmony by Persichetti. I'll send you a link to the video about that, and he mentioned it, and he was talking about how this book was written in like 1961, but it's about 20th century harmony, like, or things that were in fashion, both for classical musicians. There's not a lot of Louis Louis in here yet, but we'll see. But I thought that that was quite interesting. And then he talks about just like how to form scales, and then you could form, the modes as we normally know how to do it, just by starting on the first, second, third, fourth, blah 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 notes of each scale, like how those are offset pretty much. So I find that super interesting. But then there are these other ones where you build a scale of 8 notes or 7 notes and then start again, and the thing doesn't resolve back to the tonic for over what we would call two scales, or what we would call 16 notes. Like super duper interesting, like stuff like that I never would have thought of. Probably have no idea how I would use it. I'm sure I'm going to program something in Ableton with a piano sampler, and see like how that type of thing sounds. But
yeah.
who knows what sort of use it is? But like super interesting.
It's funny because we're recording this podcast. I'm listening to the words more carefully, and it reminds me of I've had this feeling before, but I haven't spoken in a while. But when I first learned about octave,
Uh huh.
like, oh, octave, that has 8 notes in it. No, it doesn't have 8 notes. It
Yeah.
has either 7 or 12, depending, or
Yeah.
yeah, or 12, depending on
Yeah.
how you think about it. It's like, well, why isn't it given a better name than octave?
Totally.
Because it's this terrible name for it.
Totally agreed. Yeah, we're gonna file that along with like why is the fourth so terrible suddenly? Like I have no idea.
Yeah, perfect, major, all these words they're pretty. I guess we might, as we move along further along, again, eventually we'll forget that they're terrible words, and we're just going to be thinking about the concepts that are underneath them.
Yeah.
But it is worth noting to anyone who's listening and to ourselves that part of the reason why this has been hard is because the language around it has been misleading and confusing and really
Yeah.
difficult.
I think I think there's an interesting parallel, like for you and for me and for anybody who's listening or watching this. Like the year is 2020, and when was MIDI invented? Right?
Yeah, Midi was like the 70s, right?
Yeah, or like 81 or something.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, dude, how is it that we're still using that today? Like you're writing audio kit stuff to like conform to 16 MIDI channels, are you not? Or
Yeah,
however,
pretty
or
much. They're
128, or is it? I don't know. I can't.
even when they're expanding it now, they're still very worried about backwards compatibility, and
Yeah,
it's definitely tough.
yeah,
They have. I mean, musicians are so tied to the past. And I guess that's how it's
yeah, dude.
related, right?
Totally. Yeah,
It's like it worked for me once. I'm not going to learn a new thing. We're just going to
totally.
continue with this
Yeah, we're gonna carry
technology.
around these like plugs that are like an inch and a half in diameter, and like plug them into our like Eurorack modular synth that has 1/8 inch. Like, yeah, it's a nightmare, absolute nightmare. And then virtually in the box with no cords, no plugs, no nothing. You're supposed to be thinking about MIDI channels and things that you can't even like wrap your hands around. To me, it's like this discussion of what the hell does Mixolydian mean is the same thing as like, okay, so there's an A and a B source on a MIDI channel like that I can't even see, like WTF. Like it's
Yeah.
like similar kind of thing. And like you said, people are obsessed with like backwards compatibility, but this is how it happens, man. This is totally how it happens.
And then when some people try to fix things, they sometimes miss the boat. They'll like even I've seen people, even this idea like guitar tablature, or this person who wants to change the the way music is written out to
Uh-huh.
something that is more specific towards like the keyboard orientation. I forget the name of it. I can look it up.
Piano
Uh,
roll.
It's kind of like a piano roll, basically. But then they end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater because the fact is, one of the reasons why music notation is like still alive today is it quickly evokes the sense of the music for people in the know, because they have if you have your 7 notes and those are mostly what you're playing in, then seeing them on those ledger lines makes a lot of sense. And when you want to get out of the scale, you see a sharp or a flat there, and you're immediately warned that something new is coming up. So sometimes I feel like sometimes you have to respect what's good about this. And these are technologies; they're just technologies that feel like they're ancient to us. But really, at some point, printing was a technology, and
Yep.
printing music in a way that could be reproduced by anybody and like read and thought out loud was actually, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And we're still using it today, partially because people don't like to change, but also partially because there's some good things in there.
Yeah.
And I think that more about music notation than I think about music theory vocabulary personally. But maybe that'll change as I use the vocabulary more and it becomes more part of my like inner dialogue of what music's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, like just looking at music that's written out, of course, I started like I took some sort of thing about how to play piano or something. Like, oh man, I had to be like 12 or 13 years old around the time I started playing drums. And it was like, yeah, how do you play these like standards, right? I mean, standards like the Happy Birthday song, like things like that. And like, why do they work? And of course, they're still being taught in high school as like, okay, a perfect fourth is the first few notes of Here Comes the Bride and blah, 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 like that kind of thing. Um, and that was, I mean, that's, I'm not able to look at music and hear it in my head, but I am able to look at music and go, oh, okay, it actually helps me read it sort of better, I would say. And I printed out a bunch of old stuff, like on top of Old Smoky, just to see what key it's in, and like maybe write a harmony for it, or who knows what. I mean, that those kind of simple exercises, I think, might be worth it. I don't know, like that's kind of interesting. But then all of this stuff that dude is talking about in this 20th Century Harmony book is like really, it's like really, really interesting. Again, like very low level detail. It doesn't tell me why my favorite songs sound good, but there's a lot of stuff there. Or even like Robert Fripp and his like new standard tuning for guitar, right? Guitars tune in fourths now, like standard guitars tune in fourths or fifths.
In fourths, except that there's a third between
The
the G
D,
and the B string.
yeah. And Fripp's thing is the guitar is tuned in fifths.
Yeah, and no weird shift. So
Yeah, no
basically, like
weird
a
shift,
violin with 6 strings.
totally. And that so of course that's so for you who's been playing a guitar tuned in fourths for your entire career, you're like, well, okay, I've got all this muscle memory of scales. I've got all this like whatever aesthetic understanding of this or that or the other thing. Now what do I do? But others are claiming, oh, it's such a more intuitive way to do this or that or the other thing. Like it's that's I think that's needed and kind of interesting. Yeah. So
Yeah, it's gonna be tough. It would be very hard for me to like be able to uh, improvise in a non-standard tuning at this point. Perhaps I could compose something and then learn to play it in that new tuning. But I think for me that uh, that ship has sailed. I don't think I'm going to be
yeah,
changed. But I do purposely retune my guitar at times, and I have songs that are in a different tuning. But they are my compositions, not my just stream of consciousness guitar playing where I just
yeah,
kind of I have a, not six, there's a sense for what note is coming up based on having played in this tuning for so much of my life.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, totally. And for me, like if I pick up a guitar, it'll well, I think it's almost always in some sort of open tuning. And I think for me, like my ear works a little bit better that way. But even then, like to just like if I have like a looper pedal and I just put a drone of the first few open strings that usually form some sort of chord that are nice. Even trying to improvise over that, I'm like, like I really should learn a little bit more about again what my options are on the top, the high, the two high strings, like combining them into some sort of intervals or dyads or whatever you want to call them when you play two notes, and then like understand like what that's about. I think I get such just like relaxation out of just noodling around without any sort of intent, which I also think is important. I think that stuff is. I'd like to learn more about that kind of stuff as well this way, because I mean, as I'm noodling, I'm always choosing wrong notes. It's like, oh, not that one. But sometimes with well, hopefully with enough practice at anything, like it'll be like, oh, I'm just going to choose the correct notes in this like open tuning. I think it's kind of nice. See where that might go.
Cool. So, unless you have anything else, I feel like that's a pretty good like description of where we are
Yeah.
currently and what we're kind of how we think about music theory and what we're hoping maybe to get out of it.
Uh-huh.
Um, uh, Actually, maybe it doesn't completely say about what we hope to get out of it, but
Yeah.
is there anything we'd want to say now that would be like about what we hope's coming up or what we think may be coming up for these kind of discussions?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, for me in a short time, like the things that I raised about music theory that were either surprising to me or that are like, whoa, you can actually create like an infinite, almost infinite number of scales if you do this. Like all of those things are brand new, like revelations to me. And maybe just keep some sort of, we don't have to keep like a formal tally of what those are, although that might be interesting, like a
Mhm.
notebook or something or annotations, who knows, of that kind of thing, and see what that's like. And then the other thing is like where I really want to go is to remove some of those roadblocks that I think I have in those like fragments on my hard drive. So I could actually make some sort of sense out of those things.
Oh, I
Yeah,
think it would be amazing to just share revelations. I think that would
yeah,
be compelling for whoever happens to be listening,
yeah,
and for us as a historical thing to say, "Oh, yeah, I actually remember when I first really grokked something
yeah,
because I then came in here and told Phil about it," or
yeah,
I remember when I made a change to my song and then presented here. Like, I think it's totally valid if we come here and say,
yeah,
here are some chords that we came up with and played those chords and say, for the longest time, for years, I didn't know where to go from here.
right.
But then I figured this out, and this is the how and why of how that happened. I think that'd be really, really fun to listen to.
Yeah, and then I mean, I also think that it would probably be good to kind of enrich the discussion with like, yeah, mine each discussion or make notes or something about like the videos that we allude to by this or that person, the books we talk about. And for me, I'm going pretty much randomly at this, like I do anything. Like for me, books always work. So I just find a bunch of books, have them delivered, and start at page one, like whatever that is. And then what was the other thing? Oh, and then the other thing is like for me, there was a guy I don't remember his name, and we can provide the link to it or whatever. That he did a thing about Euclidean rhythms. Have you heard of that like sort of thing? You know how that works, like fitting in a certain number of notes or a certain number
I,
of notes within a certain number of pulses, and it's
I,
mathematical.
I do not know that stuff
Oh
now.
yeah, we can talk about that. Um, and he actually created a project in Ableton Live where he like enumerated all the Euclidean rhythms, and like you
Mhm.
can turn them on and off. Like you can turn the clips on and off, and like drag them into your project and use a different Euclidean rhythm on your hi-hat pattern or your kick drum pattern or whatever based on your time signature and all that kind of stuff. I actually feel like, and it might be a monumental bit of work, or if I can find a crafty way to do it, is to do a similar thing with Ableton where I like just program in a bunch of scales and modes and accompaniment and stuff like that so that we can actually listen to these things side by side. We being you and I, if you want, and we being whoever's listening to like download it and be able to have like a resource where, and I feel like for me it would actually be a nice tactile sort of thing that I could learn how to do. That might be useful. I mean, we could tie things together like in those kinds of ways. Like I really appreciate that. For me, as somebody who's like a tutor and teacher by day, I do that all the time. If I write an article on how to solve a calculus problem or whatever, like I always get good feedback about it. And it's like, damn, people never talk about the things that you talk about when you do that. When you write up your solution, you always note these like super interesting things that nobody ever mentions that makes the light bulb come on. Like that's my bread and butter, and that's like what really makes me interested in doing what I do as my day job. And I think this could be a chance to do something like that as well.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, like if I look with my eyes at a piece of music, I don't hear it, but I mean, I have to hear it. So it may be a long path to something like that, but maybe just some sort of resources where people can start out there and play around with it. I feel like might be super helpful.
Yeah, I think if there were a good resource out there, we would just point people to it. Like, period. That would be like, we found the book.
Yeah. Right.
Goodbye. But I have honestly, I've gotten a bunch of these books, and I've never got to the end feeling comfortable. Like, even if I got to the end, there would have been some point, maybe like 30% in, where I would start to realize I'm not fully getting this. I'll continue reading the
Yeah.
words and I'll still do the exercises, and with the hope that something good comes out of it. Uh, you know, I grew up before the internet, and I remember being in school and having to read books like Moby Dick.
Yeah.
And it's a good book, great story, but it's so filled with nautical terms that eventually I would get sick and tired of looking up in an actual physical dictionary
Yeah. Yeah.
to find the word and then reading. Then you kind of lost the track of the story. And nowadays it must be great to just when don't know a word, you look it up instantly as a kid. But I
Yeah.
had to. Eventually, I got lazy, and by the end, I would lose the story somewhat because you would have had to understand some nautical term to really understand
Yeah.
something about the story. And that's what happens when I'm reading music theory in most of these books. Like,
Yeah.
they'll assume you got something and then use that terminology and build upon it, and then like you eventually get lost. So
Yeah.
if we do refer our listeners or each other to a piece of literature about this topic,
Yeah.
um, I'll be very honest about where I stopped understanding, or maybe we can work through some of those things
Yeah.
by presenting. I think that's one of the great things about actually YouTube, actually, is that the presentation of the information is right there alongside with sound. Whereas
Yeah.
with a book, maybe you're being expected to play that chord correctly. And if you didn't play that chord correctly, or you didn't give it the right feel, then the author then moves on assuming you did get it.
Yeah.
And
And you
it's not.
move on also thinking you got it sometimes, and
Oh,
then
that's
you're
even
just like,
worse, right?
oh, yeah, totally, totally. I mean, yeah, I like playing piano with my left hand. Forget about it. I mean, when I'm a drummer, my left hand is the weak hand anyway. Like I lead with my right, drumming also. So yeah, I have deficient. Like I can't play a major chord with my left hand. That requires a whole other sort of thing at the moment. Which the piano roll or whatever in software can mitigate to make these concepts come to life, which is good. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that, and just like, yeah, annotations pointing to whoever we talked about, Adam Neely, we talked about whoever else, and like those guys, have done a great job. And my knowledge of this stuff is forming like in a patchwork fashion. Like I switch contexts between two or three books. Music Theory for Dummies, right? I'm reading that, but then I'm reading this harder core seeming 20th century harmony thing. Like they're all super interesting, and I switch back and forth two or three times a day between them just to see. And then I have a stack of other books where I'm like, whoa, what am I ever going to do with this one? Like I bought them sort of naively, and then I got 10 pages in, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute, what now? But
Yeah.
I'll get back to those. Like there are those challenge books that I have that I'm like, one day I'll know enough to read this book.
Yeah. The other maybe one of the last things I want to say about that is
Yeah,
that yeah, you as a music tutor and me as like an open source framework developer, I think we both know that. Sorry, math tutor.
yeah, right.
Um, we both know that explaining this stuff to somebody else is so incredibly beneficial towards our own understanding. Like,
Totally.
until you can really explain it well to somebody else, you probably don't understand it that well.
Yep.
And once you can, you're like, oh man, I feel so empowered personally to use what I'm teaching because I
Yeah.
get it now.
Yeah, totally. And that you can find a way to have others get it as well. Like, I mean, that's it. I do two things. One, jump into random people's math homework all day long, every day, except Sunday. And then the second one is take the same problem and be able to explain it 10 different ways. And once you're able to do that, you are awesome at like your thing. Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, and I mean, drumming wise, maybe I could play the same beat or the same rhythm or whatever in two or three different ways, and we can we can choose from the palettes like what works or what doesn't work, and you know, yeah. And drumming is like a grounding sort of force in a band a lot of times, and I think a lot of these concepts, music theory wise, maybe could be a grounding sort of force in figuring out what melody and harmony and all this other stuff is as well, but not in and of itself. It's got to be relative to all the other stuff. Sounds good. So yeah, I can like follow up with you about like with some links and whatever to some of the things I mentioned, and as
Yeah.
you go through this stuff, you can ask about, or if something's missing, just ask me about it.